Welcome to history's chronicles of horror. In the long, dark, and bloody history of the Tower of London, a fortress whose very stones seem saturated with pain and despair, there existed an unwritten rule, a final boundary of decency in an indecent age. It was a line you did not cross. It was considered fundamentally unlawful to subject a woman to the agonies of the rack. And yet, for one astonishingly brave young woman, the most powerful and ruthless men in all of Tudor England decided that the laws, customs, and basic tenets of human dignity simply did not apply to her. This is the story of an Askew. She was not a queen or a noble of the highest rank. She was a 25-year-old gentlewoman whose words were considered so dangerous, whose mind was so razor-sharp, and whose faith was so profoundly unshakable that her enemies were willing to shatter legal custom to silence her. They arrested her, interrogated her, and when words failed, they resorted to a brutality that shocked even the hardened staff of the tower. They put her on the rack and personally, with their own hands, turned the wheels, dislocating her limbs and tearing her body apart until she could no longer even stand. But they could not break her spirit. Because of that incredible resilience, her story has echoed for nearly 5 centuries, a harrowing testament to unimaginable courage in the face of state-sanctioned, illegal cruelty. So, how does a young woman from the Lincolnshire gentry become the target of such extraordinary and illegal brutality? To truly understand Anne's fate, you have to step into the political and religious tinderbox of her time, the England of King Henry VIII in the mid-1540s. These were years of profound and dangerous chaos. A generation earlier, Henry had famously and violently broken with the Pope in Rome. Desperate for a male heir and infatuated with Anne Boleyn, he had cast off his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, severed 1,000 years of religious tradition, and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He had then systematically dissolved the monasteries, seizing their immense wealth and lands, a move that fundamentally reordered English society. On the surface, it looked like a full-blown Protestant revolution, but the reality was far more complex and far more perilous. Henry VIII was no Martin Luther. He was no true Protestant reformer. While he relished his new power and the wealth that came with it, he remained, in his heart and in his doctrine, a Catholic. He had discarded the Pope's authority, but he clung desperately to the core tenets of the Catholic faith he had grown up with. He was terrified of the radical new ideas coming out of Europe, fearing they would poison his kingdom and destabilize his throne. So he tried to have it both ways, creating a bizarre and deadly religious middle ground that satisfied almost no one. To enforce his own unique brand of faith, he, with the support of conservatives in his government, passed the draconian Act for Abolishing Diversity in Opinions in 1539. This law quickly earned a brutal nickname, the whip with 6 strings. It viciously reasserted core Catholic doctrines. The most important of these was transubstantiation, the absolute belief that the communion bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ. To deny this, or any of the other 5 articles covering clerical celibacy and the necessity of private mass and confession, was to commit heresy. The punishment was not imprisonment, it was death by burning, with no opportunity to recant for denying transubstantiation. This act created a kingdom of spies, informants, and shifting loyalties. The court was split into 2 warring factions, wrestling for the soul of England. On one side were the religious conservatives, the defenders of the old faith, led by the politically astute and calculating Bishop Stephen Gardiner and the ambitious, utterly ruthless Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley. On the other side were the Protestant reformers, who saw an opportunity to push England toward a true reformation. This faction gathered around Henry's 6th and final wife, the intelligent and reform-minded Queen Katherine Parr, and included influential men like Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and Edward Seymour. Both sides knew that the once mighty King Henry was fading. He was grossly overweight, plagued by a festering, painful ulcer on his leg, and prone to fits of rage and paranoia. The future of England rested not with him, but with his young son, Prince Edward. Whoever controlled the boy's regency and education would control the future religion of the entire kingdom. It was the highest stakes game of political chess imaginable, where one wrong move, one misplaced word, meant a swift and brutal trip to the executioner's block. And into this seething powder keg of ambition and fear walked a woman who refused to play by anyone's rules but her own. And Askew was not born to be a revolutionary. She was born in 1521 into the world of the landed gentry, the daughter of Sir William Askew, a wealthy Lincolnshire knight. Her father was a man of some standing, having served in the king's court, attended Henry at the famed Field of the Cloth of Gold, and even served as a juror in the trial of the men accused alongside in Bullen, and was well educated, a privilege for a woman of her time, possessing a sharp intellect and a voracious appetite for reading. Most importantly, with the king's 1538 order that an English-language Bible be placed in every parish church, and had access to the scriptures in her own tongue. She devoured the text, memorizing long passages and developing a deep, personal, and profoundly Protestant faith. That faith was about to be severely tested. When and was just 15, her older sister, Martha, who was engaged to a local Catholic landowner named Thomas Kyme, suddenly died. Determined to keep the financial and social arrangements of the marriage intact, Sir William Askew made a fateful decision. He forced his younger daughter, and to take her sister's place. The marriage was a catastrophe from the start. Thomas Kyme was a staunch, traditional Catholic, deeply rooted in the old ways. His new wife, however, was now a passionate and fiercely outspoken Protestant reformer. She didn't just quietly hold her beliefs. She debated scripture with local priests, questioned their authority, and openly called the central Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation a form of idolatry. For a woman in the 16th century to behave this way was radical. To do so in her husband's own conservative household was an act of open rebellion. Their home became a war zone of belief until her enraged and humiliated husband finally kicked her out of the house. For most women in Tudor England, being cast out by a husband would have meant social and financial ruin, a life of shame and destitution. For in Askew, it was a liberation. She traveled to London, a dangerous and audacious move for a lone woman. Once there, she boldly began using her maiden name again and did something almost unheard of. She petitioned for a divorce on scriptural grounds, arguing that her husband was an unbeliever. In the teeming, religiously charged atmosphere of the capital, she found a community of fellow reformers. She became known as the Fair Gospeler, a charismatic and intelligent preacher who hosted and spoke at secret Protestant gatherings. Her fiery sermons and profound knowledge of Scripture drew a circle of devoted followers, including, it was rumored, some of the ladies-in-waiting in Queen Katherine Parr's own reformist household. It was this courage, this refusal to be silent, and these rumored high-placed connections that placed her directly on the radar of the king's conservative council. They didn't just see a troublesome heretic, they saw a pawn, a key that could unlock the door to their ultimate political victory. In March of 1545, the hammer fell, and was arrested for heresy under the Act of the Six Articles. Her interrogators, a commission including the intimidating Bishop of London, Edmund Bonner, likely figured they were dealing with a frightened, uneducated woman they could easily bully into recanting her beliefs. They were in for a profound shock. The official records of her examinations, which in herself miraculously managed to write down from memory and have smuggled out of prison, reveal not a timid confession, but an incredible battle of wits. These writings, which form one of the earliest autobiographies by an Englishwoman, showcase a mind of steel and a spirit of fire. When they grilled her on the nature of the sacrament, the most dangerous topic of all, she used scripture and logic to turn their questions back on them. They tried to trap her into denying transubstantiation, but she answered with careful, provocative ambiguity. At one point, she parried with a simple, rustic analogy that left them seething with frustration. When asked a hypothetical about a mouse eating the consecrated host, she slyly replied by asking them, if the host should fall and a beast did eat it, did the beast receive God or no? The question was brilliant in its simplicity, exposing the logical absurdities of their position without explicitly stating her own. When they tried to trap her for the crime of teaching scripture, which was forbidden for most women under the 1543 Act for the Advancement of True Religion, she cheekily quoted St. Paul. She noted that Paul forbade women from teaching in a public congregation, but since this was a private examination with so many wise men present, she was surely allowed to speak. When they complained that she answered with so few words, she shot back with a quote from Solomon. A woman of few words is a gift of God. She ran intellectual circles around them, her knowledge of the Bible often appearing far superior to that of her inquisitors. Utterly frustrated and unable to pin an explicit, burnable heresy upon her, they were forced to release her, though only after her family connections, including a cousin named Brittany, helped secure her bail. But, and was now a marked woman. She had publicly outsmarted and humiliated some of the most powerful religious authorities in England, and they were not men who would forget or forgive such an affront. Her freedom was fleeting. By 1546, the political games at court had turned deadly serious. King Henry's health was in rapid decline, and the future of the kingdom hung in the balance. The conservative faction, led by Bishop Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, decided it was time to eliminate their greatest obstacle, the Protestant-leaning Queen Katherine Parr. They saw her influence over the aging king and, more importantly, over the young Prince Edward, as a mortal threat to their vision of a Catholic England. They began a campaign of whispers and insinuation, planting seeds of doubt in the king's paranoid mind, suggesting that his own wife, the woman who nursed him through his painful illnesses, was a dangerous heretic. Their strategy was as simple as it was brutal. They needed a confession from a known Protestant that would directly implicate the Queen and her inner circle. And they decided that an Askew, the fair gospeler, was the perfect instrument for their plot. They knew of her previous arrest, her unshakable reformist zeal, and her rumored connections to the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. If they could just apply enough pressure, enough pain, and force and to name Queen Katherine or her closest friends as fellow heretics, they would have all the ammunition they needed. They could go to the king, prove a conspiracy of heresy reaching into his own bedchamber, and convince him to sign his own wife's arrest warrant. This dark political scheme led directly to Anne's second arrest in June of 1546. This time, there would be no clever theological debates or witty scriptural parries. She was taken from Newgate prison and brought straight to the grim confines of the Tower of London. The men who now faced her were not just bishops concerned with doctrine. They were the architects of the entire plot. Present were Sir Richard Rich, a man infamous for his betrayals, including his perjured testimony that condemned Sir Thomas More, and the highest law officer in the land, the Lord Chancellor of England himself, Thomas Wriothesley. The questioning was blunt and relentless. They didn't care about the sacrament anymore. They demanded names. Names of her supporters at court. Names of gentlewomen who shared her beliefs and stood firm, her resolve unshaken. In her own words, smuggled out of the tower, her answer was simple and absolute, that I knew none. That refusal sealed her fate. If they could not get the names they so desperately needed with words, they would get them with pain. What happened next in a dark lower chamber of the White Tower was not just horrific. It violated every known custom of English law and decency. While torture itself existed in a legally murky space, requiring a warrant from the Privy Council, it was virtually unheard of to use the rack on a woman, and is one of only 2 women on record to have ever been subjected to it in the Tower's long history. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Anthony Knivet, was the man tasked with carrying out the order. He knew it was unlawful and, in a remarkable act of defiance, he at first refused, only lightly applying the torture. Wriothesley and Rich were incandescent with fury. According to Anne's own smuggled account, they berated and threatened the lieutenant for his disobedience to the king's counsel. When Knivet still refused to proceed, horrified by the illegality and cruelty of the command, an unbelievable scene unfolded. The Lord Chancellor of England and the King's Solicitor General, the 2 highest legal officers in the kingdom, threw off their expensive gowns and decided to do the torturers' work themselves. They personally grabbed the levers of the rack and began to crank the wheels, stretching Anne's body with a ferocity that appalled the Tower's own hardened staff, and later wrote of the ordeal with chilling clarity. Then they did put me on the rack, because I confessed no ladies or gentlewomen to be of my opinion, and because I lay still and did not cry. My Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands till I was nigh dead. They stretched her body until her shoulders, hips, elbows, and knees were all pulled from their sockets. Still, through the waves of blinding agony, she gave them no names. She eventually passed out from the pain. When they finally lowered her broken body and revived her, she lay on the cold stone floor, shattered but not defeated. Incredibly, For 2 more hours, she continued to argue scripture with them. They had mangled her body beyond recognition, but her will, her spirit, and her faith remained utterly untouched. They had failed. The pawn had refused to be played. On July 16, 1546, a broken Askew was carried to her own execution at Smithfield. Her injuries from the rack were so catastrophic that she could not walk or even stand. She was transported in a cart and brought to the stake in a chair, which was then used to prop up her shattered frame as they chained her limp body to the post. 3 other Protestant men, John Lascelles, Nicholas Belenian, and John Adams, were to be burned alongside her. Even in this pitiable state, her defiance was absolute. A crowd of dignitaries, including her torturer Thomas Wriothesley, had gathered on a specially constructed platform to watch her die. A priest named Dr. Nicholas Shaxton, who had once been a reformer himself but had recanted his own faith to save his skin, was ordered to preach the sermon. As he spoke and listened intently from her chair, when he quoted scripture correctly, her clear voice would call out in agreement. But when he twisted the meaning to fit the official doctrine, her voice would ring out across the square for all to hear. There he missaith, and speaketh without the book. At the very last moment, a messenger galloped forward, holding a royal pardon. It could be hers, they announced, if she would only recant. She refused to even look at the document, declaring with all the strength she had left, "I came not hither to deny my Lord and Master." With those final words, her ordeal was over. As the flames rose, some reports say a bag of gunpowder was tied around her neck as a small act of mercy to hasten her death. The plot against the Queen had crumbled. Katherine Parr, warned of the conspiracy, managed to reconcile with the king just in time. The public horror over the brutal and illegal torture of a gentlewoman was so profound that it marked a turning point. No more Protestants were executed for heresy for the remaining few months of Henry VIII's reign. An Askew story is so much more than a simple tale of martyrdom. It is the story of a writer, a preacher, a poet, and a theologian who demanded the right to think for herself in a world that routinely punished such female audacity with fire. Her survival is not in her body, but in her words. Her writings, detailing her examinations and her faith, were smuggled out of prison and published almost immediately after her death by the reformist John Bale. They became famous across England and Europe, most notably when they were included in John Foxe's monumental Acts and Monuments, more commonly known as the Book of Martyrs. This book, which chronicled the suffering of Protestant martyrs, became a foundational text of English Protestant identity, placed in cathedrals alongside the Bible itself, ensuring its story would not be forgotten. Her writings give us a rare, astonishingly vivid first-hand account of one woman's intellectual and spiritual courage against the full, terrifying power of the Tudor state. Riotously and Rich broke the established law to break her spirit, but they only succeeded in breaking her body. Her courage, her sharp words, and her unshakable faith have endured for nearly 500 years, a powerful and haunting reminder that one person's conviction can shine an inextinguishable light in the very darkest of times. If you found this chronicle of courage and conviction as compelling as we do, subscribe to History's Chronicles of Horror for more explorations into the darkest and most remarkable chapters of the past. Thank you for watching.